Stream. Hey, Shalom, and welcome to Wisdom and Torah Ministries, guys. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to have again Professor Mark Chavalas is going to come in with us. How are you, Professor? It's always nice to have you. How you doing?
I am doing well. Thank you. How about you?
I'm doing good. Trying to figure out how to deal with all the YouTube stuff and how to get in and get out and setting it up. Well, you see what I mean? Now I'm talking to myself. There it is. So let's go through this. This is what I'm telling you, man. When you go live, anything can happen. But
Yeah.
I'm delighted to be here. For all of you who are joining right now, watching this, please hit the subscribe button, hit the like, and also share with other people so you can learn from Professor. And you can also learn a little bit more about the ancient Near Eastern history and its importance to some biblical context here. So, Professor, how have you been? How are you? And go Yankees.
They lost on a walk-off last night. Sorry.
It's how you finish. It's how you finish. We'll
Yeah.
see what happens to your Dodgers in September.
Yeah.
See what
And
happens.
October. October.
I don't know. I don't know. Well, if they don't get into the series, it's not October.
Yes. Right. Right.
But I don't know. I'm a little concerned with you see, you're a Yankee at heart.
Now, now watch. See how fast this goes past?
Yeah, but you still have it in your house. You can bring it out at any time.
That's how fast the Yankees will be a mirage on, in the playoffs.
Oh, whatever, man. I don't like you right now. Anyway, let's talk about the Tower of Babel.
Oh boy.
You know that when it comes to biblical stuff, the Tower of Babel is like so much into the conspiracy of everything. And when I began to look into your areas of expertise, ancient Near East, specifically Mesopotamia, and I went to the Bible Lands Museum in Jerusalem, and I got to see what a tower that the Bible talks about looked like. We assumed it's a tower that is like the Khalifa, the one in the I think is in that is so high. But in reality, it was not the height. It was the structure was done in a particular way. We'll show a picture in a little bit, but what it represented. So tell
Yeah.
us about the Tower of Babel and what you found in ancient Near Eastern and Mesopotamian history.
Well, whether, we certainly didn't find a tower intact, but it looks as if every city probably had some sort of temple tower, or they would have a lower temple at the base of the tower, and then they would have a temple at the top, which would be only accessible to the priesthood, not to others. And so Babylon was not unique in that. And so, for example, I think the best one preserved is the temple tower at Ur, which usually is often seen. And I think that you could, when the Americans invaded Iraq in '03, the Temple Tower was protected at Ur, but it's probably the best one. It's called the ziggurat
Right.
uh, in Akkadian, and so certainly that's what the Genesis writer is talking about is the Temple Tower there, and in Babylon um, the higher temple was called the Etemenanki in Sumeria, which means like the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth. In other words, it's like the center of the universe,
Right.
for them. And so uh, So, like I said, it could we theoretically think that we found them everywhere. Nearby Babylon, there's a dilapidated temple tower. It wasn't the original Tower of Babel, but it was. But yes, that's the reconstruction of the one at Ur, and so you can basically think of the tower as from the base you're walking up, and there will be a few more steps to get to the highest level temple. And like I said, none of them have survived intact, and of course that's because they're made of mud brick instead of stone. And so this is a reconstruction, and the Iraqis actually did tried to reconstruct it. Uh, and of course Saddam seemed to want to reconstruct everything including Babylon. He didn't get very far, evidently.
Right.
From
It's interesting because that's what I saw in the Babylon's museum. This is exactly what I saw. And for what I gather, you can correct me if I'm wrong. It's not really a place of worship. They put the top. It was more like they put like a chair and they expected the God to come down and visit.
Yes, in fact, if you think about it, any Mesopotamian temple was not really there. It's the average person isn't going to go worship there. It was not unlike the what Josephus says about the Hebrew temple in the sense that there's gradations of people who can get closer and closer, but how many people could actually go inside the sanctuary itself? That's a very small number.
Right.
So, yeah, there's the reconstruction of the Ur Temple Tower. Again, this is, of course, the one that Abraham would have known well.
Right.
Uh, I don't know the exact dates of Abraham. Nobody does, but the point is that he would have been very familiar with something like that. Uh, and so no, you're right. The regular person would worship outside or would want to make sure that they were nearby on the new year when the statue of the deity would come out of the temple. It wouldn't be at the top uh, um, building, and of course most buildings were near the ground, but they saw the same understanding that the Bible has about high places, and of course what's the complaint that on every high place that a pagan shrine would be built, and that's very true. And I think the idea is that you're closer to the heavenly realm if the higher up you are.
You know that in the temple in Jerusalem was built actually as a cigarette. People don't know that. There was a mountain, Mount Moriah. You have Ophel. You have the little elevations, and then you have to go from one elevation to the next one. So it looked like no one will see it when you look at the platform, but when you understand the archaeology, you see the from one level of holiness to the higher level to the higher level to a higher level, and it's not that God is utilizing something the nations did. It's just that everyone understood about sacred space. So this was common
Yes.
ground to them. Now, what's interesting, if I may, one biblical connection, and you know this because you know you study the Akkadian, but the word Babel is kind of interesting as I'm going through my research, right?
Yeah.
And the Akkadian is Bab Ilu, which means gate of God. It's quite
Yeah.
interesting.
Yes. In fact, um, the the Sumerogram, not that this is going to matter to anybody, Kag Dingataraki, which literally in Sumerian means the gate of the gods. And so it was probably put into a folk etymology in Akkadian and literally means Bab Ilu, the gate of the gods. Now, of course, the writer in Genesis 11 is literally making fun of that. And so he takes the Hebrew root Balal to mean confusion
Right,
rather than that. And so it's really if you think about it, it's a really nasty satire
right.
on the pagan ideas. Now the question is, when is all this happening? And maybe we can get into that.
And it's
Uh,
interesting also that the Bible talks about how they were all speaking one language that one time. But then you have the ancient Sumerian texts, such as the Enmerkar and the Lord of the Arata described. There you go. What is that writing on the ancient world? Very good book. I
this
have
is
that one.
Epics of Sumerian Kings, and so this is the one Vantaspout, which has that epic in there,
Yeah.
the Enoch epic.
And it
Um,
talks about when all the people spoke one language and Enki confusing their speech. I think now it kind of makes sense how the story of the Bible is kind of making mockery of what they were doing and establishing God as the one who really has that authority. Not, thank you.
Yes, and it's and worse than that. When I sent you that article by Clam uh, to look at, she's the argument is that um, when it talks about one speech, it can either mean they are of the same speech or of one mind. In other words, it's probably not emphasizing as much about the fact that languages got confused. It's the overall confusion that Babylon thinks it's the centerpiece of the world. And of course, it says the people were of literally one lip, not
Right.
one tongue, which is really, really odd. Just as a funny aside, at least I think it's funny, a colleague of mine, Wayne Pittard, uh, uh, took that when he was a graduate student at Harvard and made a whole paper on the fact that before the flood, everyone only had one lip because it said they were a people of one lip. And so you couldn't speak very well if you had one lip and you would slobber a lot. And so he just emphasizes that and proves it because at Jericho they found skulls that didn't have the lower jaw. And so it was the joking proof. All right, you had to be there evidently.
It's
But
just that there's something always new.
but the thing is, uh, as you know, the Bible never puts any words in there that are accidental. They always have meaning. And so why does it say they were of one lip rather than something else? It's because when Marduk in the Enuma Elish in the Babylonian creation epic, when he's attacking and throwing words against Tiamat, he's using incantations to defeat her. He's doing it with his lips, it says. And so I think the Genesis writer is making a mockery of that. And I think that Clam is right that in many respects, the Babel story is basically turning the understanding of Babylon and its creation epic, which is the closest thing that they would have to be the equivalent of a pagan Bible,
Right.
because it was read every New Year's, as far as we know. It's probably the most quoted text in all of Mesopotamia is their creation epic. I know we talked a little about it before, but um, some of the terminology that is used in it is uh, the Bible uses almost the reverse of it, as if everyone knows what we're talking about, and we're going to show that it's turning it on its head. I think the biblical writer did that with Genesis 1 and 2, showing that our version of creation is the correct one. It's the one with the true God in it. Here's the correct version of what's really going on. Babylon is not the centerpiece of all wisdom. Uh, it's God. In fact, God comes down and confuses them and turns it all on their head.
So it's really all about a little bit of an irony.
Absolutely an irony. In fact, but my next question is, and tell me if you want to go here or not. My next question is, I wonder when all this is being written down and what it's for, because the Babylonian creation epic in the edition that we have doesn't go back earlier than about the time of King David, maybe even later. It's quite late. There probably are earlier recensions that didn't even have Marduk as the centerpiece. There's one god missing in the creation epic, and it's Enlil, who was the king of the gods.
And yeah,
He's missing.
yeah.
Uh, and so what does that mean? Is this I think the story goes back very, very early, but the edition we have here might be late, and it might be during the time that the Jews are captive in Babylon. I don't know. It
Well, I mean, even if that's the case, which it could be what it could very well be, but it would make sense from a theological perspective for the Jews because they want to convey in the time of captivity, they still believe that the God of Israel still had dominion over creation.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
it would have been a way to be an affront to the belief system of the Babylonians, which, by the way, during the time of Daniel, we have how he's defending the integrity of the God of Israel. There were miracles going on accordingly. So.
And you know, if
Quite
anybody
interesting.
has a problem with this whole concept of authorship, I guess my first comment is we can't always know how God decided to impart his truth to us. And so we need to be open to realize if there is a later edition, guess what? That was divinely inspired too. There's nothing, this is
Right.
not about inspiration. This is about, how it came down to us. And maybe we can talk about that. So,
I, wa- I,
but
wa- I was
go ahead.
actually doing an interview this morning with two of my friends, a podcast that I'm going to release later this week about wisdom literature.
Oh,
And we
neat.
were actually talking about the metaphors and exactly what we're talking about. That sometimes we get so boxed in thinking everything has to fit in one time frame, which
Yeah.
we want that and we don't have a problem with it. But if it happened later, the fact that it still relates to story and that we can still understand who is a sovereign and there's a story behind the story every time there's a story in the Bible,
Yeah.
like an example, the meaning of the word Babel, but in Akkadian, right, which is the gate of the God, right? Then we have
Yes.
a contrast in Genesis 28. In Genesis 28, verse 10, you well know when Jacob left Beersheba and he set out for Haran, he's going to Laban's house, which is northern, Syria, up
Yeah.
there near Padam Aram,
Right.
okay, which you have articles on that
Yes.
area anyway.
Yeah.
So he reached a certain place where he decided because the sun had gone down, he took one of the stones and placed it near his head. He fell asleep on that place. He had a dream. He saw a stairway erected on the earth. When it stopped reaching the heavens, the angels of God were going up and down, coming, and he stood at the top. You know exactly what that is. It's
Yeah.
a cigarette.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
we have the ancient seals show ascending and descending. But then Jacob says something quite interesting. He says, God speaks to him, I am the God, I am the Lord, the God of your grandfather Abraham, and the God of your father Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the ground you are lying on. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth. You will be spread out to the west, to the east, to the north, and the south, and all the families of the earth may be received blessing through you and through your descendants. I am with you. I will protect you. And whenever you go and bring you back to this land, I will not leave you until I have done what I promise. When Jacob wakes up in verse 17, he says, he was afraid and said, what an awesome place this is. This is nothing else than the house of God. This is the
And
gate of heaven.
gate of heaven. Yeah.
So it's not any different than the Akkadian definition of what a sacred space was to them.
I think you're right. Any Hebrew listener at that point is gonna recognize exactly what he's saying and what
Yeah.
the irony. We miss it, of course, and I miss it if I'm reading this. You have to. You're right. You have to look at it and find out. Why is he doing this? That makes perfect sense because Babylon is not just the political evil one; it's the intellectual evil one. Because it's the center of polytheism, and it takes all of that in such a dangerous way.
Yeah, I'm right here. I'm sorry, I have to check
Yeah,
something.
that's all right.
Um, I find it interesting as I study the ancient Near East. When this, I gotta tell you, this makes sense to me when I went to the Bible Lands Museum in Jerusalem. And I started doing tours and go on taking and the first day in Jerusalem. It's a museum day. We go to the Bible lands, then we go to the Jerusalem Museum. We literally spent there 3 hours between both, and there's a lot to learn. And then when I was there the first time, and I saw the ziggurat, then all of a sudden Genesis 28 makes sense,
Yeah.
and I'm going like, wait, now the story of Babel in chapter 10 and 11 makes sense.
Oh
Why
yeah.
the Lord he confuses whatever it was, languages or the one lip.
Yep.
Okay. But then the story goes left field. I mean, it leaves it's the worst movie cliffhanger ever. It's like it's talking about Babel. They got confused, they get scattered, and then it goes to Abraham.
Yeah.
But
That's
then
it's an
I'm
amazing.
thinking, yeah, but why? And then when you read the stories and you know the reason for the tower and the reason for the judgment, was that they want to make themselves a great name.
Yes.
And then Abraham is trying to make God's name great. And by default, God makes his name great.
Yeah,
What a contrast saying humanity want to make their own name great by trying to reach the level of God, which was the sin in the garden.
right.
But Abraham is loyal to God regardless of what. And God, for his loyalty, is going to make him great and his name great. What
And
a
the
contrast.
and not only that, think about it. How did he do this? He pulled out one of those Babel people to do it with. You
Hey, how do you
know,
think about that? That's right. He took,
he's a
that's,
Babylonian. I mean,
that's great.
and so, and of course, you look at Jewish tradition about Abraham. They try to they in Jewish tradition, Abraham is the son of an idol maker, and so
Right.
he's trying to figure all this stuff out. Um, and so even if he wasn't, the point is that he's clearly thoroughly a Mesopotamian. And he's probably, for all I know, he could have even been a priest or whatever. I don't know, a professional person. And so God pulls him out of that mire. And I suppose it'd be like going to deepest, darkest Africa and God speaking to a witch doctor,
Yeah.
and they become a believer at that point. It's like that's the last person you would think, that would turn over. Who knows?
Do you think that Abraham was not just a lowly shepherd, that he was a man of status in Babylon? I have that opinion.
I think I entirely agree. You think about it. I mean, here he is living uh, at at the city of Ur is the most powerful city on the face of the earth at the time, and so it would be like today. I don't know, living in New York City. Although no, I don't. Not sure if you why you'd want to
True.
right now. But the point is, that would be like going from New York City and coming to flyover country. Where I live, or somewhere in the middle of the wasteland of the just before the Rockies where there's hardly any people. And so, no, he's
Yeah.
not. He might end up becoming a humble shepherd, although but not too many humble shepherds can lead small armies against other kings in Genesis 14. So I think there's a whole lot more going on there uh, than we give it credit. And I think studying the context of the ancient Near East helps me get a better, handle on this. And by the way, I think that Genesis 11 is chronologically after Genesis 10, if you think about it. Uh, you can't have all those nations until there's a disbursement. And when does the disbursement happen? At Babel. And so
Right.
God still, and so what's the reason for it to be chronologically out of order? Because they want to emphasize the fact that Abram came out of this tradition. You know, this is about the most random and least expected person on the planet that you would expect that would decide to follow the one true God. Uh,
Well, I mean, if you really think about it, now that you kind of make that connection. All the years I never really made the connection that God is actually using one of them to start
yeah,
something new.
yeah,
So that has to basically give us evidence of the loyalty of seeking truth. Because later on in chapter 15, in chapter 14, we talked about that last week,
yeah,
how he was loyal to God when he met the king of Sodom, and then God rewarded him because of that.
yes,
So I mean, this is one of those things, Professor, that when you study it from a cultural perspective, the whole perception of who Abraham was really changes because we all assume he's some lowly shepherd walking in the midst of nothing, but he had to be somebody of status who understood many things that a regular shepherd's not going to understand.
yeah,
And he had a lot to lose by leaving that particular place that you talked about,
yeah.
the land of Ur.
I think he's a full urbanite. And like I said, probably a professional person who is now basically sacrificing all of that. And think about it. What does God tell him to do? He offers him something wonderful and he says, just walk and I'll tell you when to stop.
Yeah.
Uh, it's like, does he have any other idea? That the writer wants to make it clear that Abraham does not know anything more than this God has reached out to him. He doesn't tell him that he's exclusive. He doesn't tell him anything else other than the fact, I'm God and I'm offering you something. And Abraham of course, like any of us, has an opportunity to reject it. Uh, and of course, he does some ignorant things in 12 and 13, and
Yeah,
then, but he's loyal, like David, like any of us.
right, right, right. I was reading through some of the research, and I was looking if there was like any other evidence of someone testifying about the Tower of Babel, and I found the inscription of Nebuchadnezzar II, referring to the Tower of Babel. It's a cuneiform. Is
Yeah.
the I'm pretty sure you can pronounce it better than me. Etemenanki.
Yes. That's the one
Uh,
I mentioned at the beginning, the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth. That's the Sumerian
right.
name of it. Yes.
That's it. Yeah. So they actually, found a text when in the sixth century, they say BCE, the tower, the eternal house, which I founded and built. This is translated from the Akkadian.
Yeah.
And the upper terrace I built with bitumen and bricks. I completed its magnificence with silver, gold, and precious stones. The house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Its top I may reach the heavens. Its name I made to be known in all the lands. East India House inscription by British Museum. Wow. I mean, you read that, you think I'm thinking language that God uses for his temple in Jerusalem.
Yes, exactly. Well, you think about it, they're living in the same cultural milieu, so we shouldn't be surprised that they're doing that. What a Hebrew would say would be that you've got your description right, you've got the God wrong. And so so we attribute that to, the God of Israel, not to that. Nebuchadnezzar's father, does the same thing where he talks about the ziggurat. By the way, we know that textually speaking, we know the history of the ziggurat. And Sennacherib, the king who's mentioned in 2 Kings, um, the Assyrian was the enemy of Babylon. He came down and destroyed Babylon, destroyed the ziggurat. And as far as we can tell, he basically took the statue of Marduk and Marduk's bed back up up to Nineveh at this point, which would completely, make Babylon impotent. By the way, a side note on Marduk's bed. Um, there's only one bed described in the entire Bible. It's King Og. Uh,
Right.
and and the dimensions of his bed are identical to Marduk's. Um,
It's quite big.
yes, but the point is that when you defeat an enemy, you take his bed, and so he can't sire. I think maybe I mentioned this last week. I can't remember now what podcast I was on, but you're taking that person's power away, and so they took Marduk's power away. Uh, uh, Babylon was rebuilt by Sennacherib's son Esarhaddon, and then destroyed again by his grandson Ashurbanipal, and then rebuilt once again by Nebuchadnezzar's father Nabopolassar, who also has a nice inscription about the ziggurat. And so there it is for all the Jews to see when they're deported, by Nebuchadnezzar into the land. They can either see it or what Spicer said, and he might be right, is that they're either physically looking at the temple tower or they're looking at its description in the Babylonian creation epic, because Marduk is the one who ultimately creates this as a great tower for the humans who um, um, he makes so they can come and worship. And
So I got a question about that. It's quite interesting that when you give that whole line of the kings, and I want to ask you about the bed and the king removing the power. I never heard that before. I want to expand a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I
But
thought so.
thinking about what you just mentioned, that they rebuilt it during the time of the Babylonians,
Yes.
then it now makes sense the vision of Ezekiel, because he's actually overlooking, and we know it had to be next to the river because they had the city next to
Yeah.
the Euphrates.
Right.
So it's like now he has the contrast looking at you know, the Tower of Heaven versus what God is going to bring forth which represents authority and power. It's
Yeah.
quite interesting. I never really thought about that until now that you mentioned it, because I thought after the periods of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I didn't think about if they will rebuild it again. It wasn't until Saddam Hussein wanted to rebuild it that I
Yes.
realized,
Yeah.
oh, because that's the reason why, one of the reasons, he wanted to restore the ancient old Babylonian kingdom.
It's interesting that that temple tower through history, um, it will last. It's still there during the beginning of the Persian period with Cyrus, but then the Babylonians rebel against Xerxes a couple of times, and Xerxes pretty much levels the temple economy in Babylon. And we know this a little bit from cuneiform sources, but also Greek sources. And then Alexander wants to restore it. There's tremendous amount of scribal activity in Babylonia for the next 500 years until even after the Parthians. But they uh, but Alexander couldn't get the temple tower completely rebuilt, from
Yeah,
what we can tell. And
but
then,
it
of course,
only
laid there.
it only goes to show how important those towers were to them, though.
Yes,
Just like it is important for Israel to have their temple. And I
yes,
know that in the Christian theology versus the Torah, I know there is a discrepancy of understanding of how important the temple is to Israel, especially for okay, so if the temples were built for the gods, obviously, and the
yes.
kings always built, that was one of the things they always did. That's why David wanted to build a temple to God, and Solomon built a temple. So wouldn't it be logical for Messiah when he returns do exactly what the vision of Ezekiel says? It's a sign of victory over the God they worship or they serve.
Well, that does make sense. How it'll all flesh out, I guess we'll find out. And
Oof, yeah.
yeah, but yes, I mean that in terms of the ancient Near Eastern conception, that's exactly what the temple is God's abode. Of course, what that ends up meaning. I guess we'll all probably be surprised.
Yeah. So tell me about the bed. I'm shocked by it. I have to come back to that.
No, I'll send you an article about this. So
There is an article about that too.
oh, yeah, somebody actually wrote on this. I already forget their name here, but I just did this recently.
Oh, wait, wait, wait. How can you forget their name? You just went down about seven ancient Near Eastern names that I can't even pronounce. And I study them. And you went through them like nothing.
Yeah, but I've known those for a long time. It's recent memory that I
Okay.
like. What's your name again? Anyway,
I
so
don't know. I'll go Yankees. That's all I know.
so um, so King Og's, think about it. What is it, Deuteronomy 3, where all of a sudden they keep on talking about the fact that they defeat Sihon and Og the king of the Amorites. Um, and then it has, if you think about it, it's just about the most random statement in all of the Bible. It's like, hey, we defeated Og. And by the way, he had a really, really big bed and it had these very particular dimensions.
Yeah, that's quite interesting.
Well, you think about it. I mean, your first blush is like, why do I need to know this? This would be like, me going into your house and say, hey, Rico invited me over, but the first thing I did was I went into his bedroom. I wanted to see if he had a king size bed and I measured it. I came out and first of all, I would probably be in trouble because that was a social faux pas. But it's like,
Uh-huh.
who gives a rip, whether and so that's the first thought. But anybody reading that knows very well that that's the same dimensions as the bed of Marduk.
Yeah, but we don't know that. We're in the Western world. How in the world will we able to get that? Think
Well,
about it. I mean, it's so
anybody,
random.
when I say anybody, I'm sorry, I mean anybody who's living at the time of the writing, they're gonna see that and they're gonna know exactly what's going on here. And
Uh-huh.
if the final edition is during the period of the captivity, then they're going to know exactly what's going on here. And they also know that Og lost his bed and his virility like Marduk does. It doesn't mean Og's divine. It means that, Og is a defeated enemy and we got the proof, we got the bed, you can go see it. Uh, and it's and
The
it's
language is so different.
yeah, and it's just like what's going to happen or what's going to happen to Marduk is
Right.
what they're saying, is that he's going to get his too. So so you're right. It's lost on us because really, think about it. Somebody's preaching on Deuteronomy 3. They're going to look at that Og's bed and they're going to say, "Okay, never mind that. Let's move on."
Let
Um,
me. I just did a quick search on the logos here about the king of. I tell you, oh, you blew me away. So today you really surprised me with this. All
good.
right, so then I look right. It's a quick thing
There it
that they
is.
have there.
That's it. Lundquist. Lindquist.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Lindquist, Maria Lindquist, from the
Yep.
Catholic Biblical Quarterly, right? And
Yep.
it says the Iron Bed of Og may be conceived as a battle trophy, signaling his utter defeat at the hands of the Israelite warrior god. Booty, the bed fits the context, Deuteronomy 3, the conquest account that appears to incorporate Neo-Syrian military motifs. The bed should be considered in light of royal bed sizes by invading Assyrian armies. A war trophy, I never thought about that before.
Yeah.
And it says the size and substance of Og's bed takes on greater importance. The
Yeah.
size attests to a statue of Og and supports Deuteronomy's claim that Og was one of the giant Rephaim.
Yeah.
The dimension of the bed corresponds to those of another famous bed, that of Marduk. Interesting. By setting Og's bed alongside the bed of the major deity, the author likens Og to a god and bolsters his status as a superhuman warrior. So, okay.
I disagree with
Oh,
the
yeah, the conclusion,
God as
right?
a God, but I do agree with everything else. And so and we actually have Akkadian text, the Syrian text, talking about the fact that Marduk's bed has been taken to Assyria.
But so, okay, so can I say that maybe the size may not be okay? Okay, let me frame this. So I could say then that the height of Og is not the point; is his status.
Yeah, I think so.
Ah,
Yeah, of
see, I thought it was his size that he was big,
course, of course.
but it's
Uh,
basically what the bed represented, not how tall he was.
See, this is why you have to study Mesopotamia
Man, I've been doing it for 16 years. What happened?
for this. Yeah, for this one little point. Uh, uh, and then all will be well. But no, think about it. It informs me for with this seemingly random little piece of information that seems counterintuitive to me. Like, why do I need to know this?
Yeah.
Oh, this is from God. There's always a reason, even if I don't know what it is, and it's going to come out. And Lundquist wrote this article about a dozen or so years ago. I didn't see it till recently, by the way, but once I saw it, uh, um, then I mean, look how fast you picked it up going through Logos there.
Well, but that's the thing. It's like here we are thinking, wow, this guy must have been a giant. Maybe he was, but now we have to consider another another perspective of his importance. And I
Yeah.
think sometimes we can be so literal, we miss those little nuances behind the text.
Yes, and so he so in other words, the whole point of this is Babylon's going to be taken down just like Og.
Right.
That's what I think the message is. Um,
That's really cool.
yeah, it's
I
good. We
I
don't have to do a whole study just on Og. Good.
well, but no, no, seriously, these are little points that maybe the audience, because maybe they're not as focused on these things as you and I are, more you than me, although I'm behind you by 30, by 30 years, I think.
Yeah, but you're just as intense.
But the thing is that these little details makes us realize that the narrative, the biblical narrative, is maybe more multidimensional. In other words, the Bible is trying to convey a message behind a particular piece of information that we are looking at it literally,
Yes.
but the person and the people living at that time frame would have understood right away. It's like, oh yeah, yeah, that means that he was a very important king, and everyone argues whether he was a giant or not, and they're
Yes.
missing the point maybe.
I think that's exactly what it is. And I think the same thing is happening with Genesis 11. Let me see if I can find the comparison part here. Here we go. You know, in Genesis 11, the the what a third or fourth third or maybe the third verse, when the Babelites say, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." Um, you know, this is probably mocking something that Marduk says in the Enuma Elish. And so in Enuma Elish 6, and by the way, this is on page 119 of that Clam article that I sent you. So
Uh-huh.
take a look at that. You know, when Marduk heard this, he beamed as brightly as the light of day. Build Babylon, the task you sought. Let bricks for it be molded, and raise up the shrine. And by the way, the other temple at Babylon is the Esagila, which means house of the raised head, and it's raising up its head to heaven. And so
Yeah.
that's what the biblical writer is mocking. And guess who has to build the temple? The Anunnaki, who we talked about before.
Oh yeah,
And
earlier.
they bitterly complain about it. And so Marduk says, "All right, fine, I'll make some humans." But the Anunnaki work on this for a whole year and they can't get finished. Uh, and it says, when the second year arrived, they raised the peak of Esagil, the house with its head raised, and call it, "This is Babylon, gate of the gods." And um, you think about it, what does the writer in Genesis say? "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its head up into the heavens." And so it's making fun of the
What
temple of the.
what verse are you in there?
It doesn't give the verse, and so it must be what, three or four. I'll look at the. I'm looking at her article, and so now I have to look at the yeah, verse 3 it looks like.
The word it uses the word top here. Yeah, rush. Oh yeah. Ah,
Yeah,
Lord.
Roche, the head.
Let me
Yeah,
let me share the screen on that because this is an example.
yeah.
Is an example of when we don't know the ancient history and now we're connecting it. So let's read that verse again. What happened here? I mean, it's not. Where's the verse? Give me a second.
Excuse me.
So when we go to
There we
Genesis
go.
11,
Yeah, you're there.
yeah, and it says, and they said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had bricks of stone. They had tar and mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top reaches to the heavens."
There's the
But
Roche.
when we look at the word top, is the word rush,
Nagin.
head.
Yes, the top, upper, whatever. It's
Yeah, the
like,
top.
you know,
Oh, so
yeah.
okay.
And by the way, the verse before that is making fun of their building materials. Think about it. It's
Uh-huh.
it says, you know, and so they made brick for stone and bitumen for mortar, or whatever it says there. But the point is that they can't even get it right. They use bricks instead of stone and tar for mortar. Everyone knows that's not what you're supposed to use. And of course, every Babylonian king, uh, uh, he always, when he wants to talk about how good he is, he's got two things, two main things. It's, I was good militarily, but I was also good architecturally. I built lots of good things for the gods.
That's true because Herod is known for all
Yeah.
his main constructions as well as Nebuchadnezzar, and that's why
Yeah.
you have the Bible talk about the big old images and the hanging gardens and everything. They were known for gardeners and architecture.
And and not only that, with bricks, there are a couple of Assyrian kings, and I think there might even be Nabonidus, the last Babylonian king. They'll, to show how pious they are, they'll have a basket of bricks on their head, showing that it, I suppose it'd be like you or me starting to build something. And so we have the shovel to do the first, you know, break into the ground. We don't actually build it ourselves. All our underlings do it, but we're the one who's, you know, the originator. So the Assyrian or Babylonian kings will have a basket of bricks on their head, um, showing that they're the builder. And this is making fun of all of that.
But I never caught on to that verse 3. And they said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And then it says, and they had brick for stone,
Yeah,
and they had tar for mortar.
yeah.
And Yeah,
So it's
you're right. I've
kind
never
of
really noticed.
yeah, again, you've just got to go into the weeds and read slowly as if you've never read it before and say, why would they say that? That doesn't make any sense. It's not as weird as Og's bed, but still it's like why do I need to know that they had, bricks for stone and tar for mortar? It's like you wouldn't believe these guys. They can't even do their building correctly.
Right. So meaning that they didn't know what they were doing.
They don't know what they're doing. And it's after that think of it, then God comes down. And by the way, there's a kid story. I forgot to go get this. Um, you should get this for your granddaughter. There's a little kid story called Mabel and the Tower of Babel, where the king of Babylon has a fictional little daughter who's a Yahweh worshiper, or at least she knows that there's a true God. And so whenever they start making these, things, Mabel says it's not going to work. It won't work. So everybody out there, get Mabel and the Tower of Babel. I forget
Mabel
who
and Tower of
it is,
Babel.
but but and at the end of the story, she's sort of sad because uh, all the people now ran away and they got confused languages, and she's sitting there having to learn all these new languages on cuneiform tablets like an Assyriologist, and she's perplexed. A really clever little book, but anyway,
I
uh,
didn't know. I didn't know. Man, there's a whole bunch of stuff I didn't know about. You're hitting 1,000 today. You've been hanging around, Otani too much.
well, he hit a home run last night too, but so
Yeah, man. He pitches, he runs, he hits.
I,
You're on fire today.
yeah, I'm on fire. Yeah, I
That's
don't.
some seriously, that's some really great information because I read this many, many times and I've never really made those connections because I didn't really read those articles until you send them to me. I didn't even know existed. So now think about this. Many people will suggest and think, why is this so important? Well, if we're going to read the creation stories in the book of Genesis, I think we should consider being aware of the culture and the language and how they lived in that time frame.
Yeah,
Otherwise, we're going to miss things like this.
exactly right. And so it's not like we both said 100 times. It's not that none this is required, but this adds so much texture to understanding our Bible. This is not for salvation. It's not for, you know, uh, ultimate belief, but it just provides so much more nuance and texture to what I'm reading, and it helps me understand it. And to me, ultimately, it gives me a greater confidence uh, in how understanding how God operates. And so again, I could be like a 4-year-old and not know any more than a 4-year-old and have my relationship with God, but this just
Yeah.
adds to it.
I got a question. Do you see a connection between um, the Tower of Babel, what happened there, and how God brought Israel to Mount Sinai from the tower that represents a cosmic mountain
Yes.
to Mount Sinai, who was the cosmic mountain, where God did come down. And then even the rabbis say that when God spoke, it divided in the 70 languages, in
Ah,
different languages.
yeah. And
So
again, that in fact that it's interesting. Uh, you have Genesis 10 and you have Genesis 11. And of course, the only thing that connects them is probably Nimrod, who maybe we'll talk about a little bit. But Genesis 10 doesn't look like a negative thing. In other words, I'm suspicious that it's because so God confused all their languages, but once he does that, now he's going to do good out of that too. And so
yeah,
now that all you humans have done this disbursement, don't worry, I'm still gracious. I'm still going to make something good out of it. And so we have the 70 nations that are mentioned. Of course, how did the rabbis know there were 70? Because they
yeah, I
counted them.
understand.
But and
Yeah,
of course that's a prime number, seven, 10 times seven. Um, and so it's not even hinted at in 10 and that's a bad thing. But then of course you read 11 and you're saying, oh, well, that's why, it's not simply a story to explain how we got our multiple languages. It's also to show that, God confounded the wisdom of the earth the central wisdom, which is centered around Babylon. And Babylon thinks it's so great and so smart. And so so you're right. Then he goes to Sinai with this. And as you, I'm sure already know because you mentioned this before, this culminates again with Pentecost, where
Right,
all the nations come back and all the mingled nations come back and they're understood. And of course, what are they hearing? They're hearing about the great deeds of God.
right.
Yeah.
I do you think that the whole shifting and the transition on the story and the narrative going from Babel and telling us there was a great dispersion,
Yeah.
which the same thing happened with Israel because of disobedience.
Right.
But then it goes to Abram. It appears to me that Abraham becomes like an Adamic figure in that
Yes,
story.
absolutely.
So you
But
see that with Moses too, you know?
yes, in fact, you think about it, it would have been better if we weren't dispersed. Then God could have come to someone like Abraham and his message would have gotten around very quickly
Yeah,
everywhere. But instead, it had to be dispersed. And you think about it, the message that God gave to Abraham has still not reached the ends of the earth yet. Here we are
it's true.
4,000 years later, and
It's
there are
true.
there are still places that have never heard about the Messiah. They've never heard about
Right.
the message. And you're thinking, wow, I mean, here, how can this be? And so, and of course, what happens? God has told Abram, all the nations will be blessed through you.
Well,
And
that's the message of the gospel,
yeah,
that all the nations will be blessed through Abraham,
yeah,
through the resurrection. I
yeah,
find it, sometimes we don't think that ancient Near Eastern studies can enhance our understanding of the New Testament. And we see the events of Yeshua, for example, in the Transfiguration. He goes to a mountain, there's a transfiguration there, and, God comes down. Basically, it
yes.
just like comes down to meet Moses. And it's the story meeting over and over and over and over. It's quite interesting.
Really, you think about it, who's there? Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets.
Yeah.
They represent the word of God. And of course, there aren't a lot of mountains around there. And so I know Mike Heiser has argued that it's probably Mount Hermon, uh, where the pagan, mountains are. And so who knows? I mean, but the
Well,
point,
well, it's interesting you say that because even according to Jewish tradition, they believe that Mount Hermon was the place where the covenant of the pieces occurred.
yeah. Well, that's interesting. That would make sense. And of course, in First Enoch, which of course is not, though it's not canonical, it certainly shows what the Jews are thinking. That's where the angels come down and make their pact about going and intermarrying
Right.
with the humans. And so it would be delicious irony if God is now taking that same place and reversing it.
Or isn't that the same time, the same message, the last message in the book of Revelation, that the New Jerusalem comes down and God will dwell amongst people
Yes.
after 1,000 years, after Messiah reigns?
Yeah,
So
that's it.
isn't
Temple.
that the same story as in the Babel story, but in reverse?
I think the whole thing is you're reverse. And so you see, I mean, even if you're simply a literature person, you should be able to see this and see how all of these themes are coming together and being wrapped up. And so in other words, and you're right, you cannot understand Revelation unless you understand Genesis, but also the ancient Near Eastern parallels that they're writing in context in that environment. Then it began, all the puzzle pieces began to fall into place. The Revelation is, of course, uh, one of the books I'd like to work on someday, and maybe in after age 100. But
Well, I just find it quite interesting how I began to study, when I began to study the ancient Near Eastern history, in the beginning, it was a little bit confusing because I was not connecting the motifs behind the message. I was only reading the message. So when I understood the importance of righteousness and justice and honor and shame, new creation, chaos versus order, everything began to make more sense. I'm thinking, okay, I see now what we talked about this before in our first podcast. If you haven't seen it, go back to the beginning of our playlist on Wisdom and Torah and check it out. I think you're going to be blessed. We've been together for almost 30 weeks doing
Yeah,
these, and we've covered a lot of ground. And but when I began to study it, to me it was kind of confusing because it seemed like everything was the same. And then what I began to look into, I'm thinking, I asked one question, and based on Psalm 89:14, righteousness and justice is the foundation of God's throne. And that made me think. I started asking questions. So wait a minute. I'm always defining terms according to the way I understand them in the Western world.
yeah,
But how, what was righteousness and justice in God's definition? And that's when the Code of Hammurabi and the
yeah,
Torah was a huge contrast because there were laws that are exactly the same in the way they're written, but the way they're executed in righteousness and justice
yeah.
shows the righteousness of God as a king over Hammurabi. And that's the point.
That's right. It's so you're right. The meaning behind the law is the big deal.
Uh,
People say, "Oh, they just copied those laws." I've had people on my podcast, "Oh yeah, the Israelites just copied all this stuff." And I said, "Dude, you missed the whole point. They don't copy anything. They're living in that environment and they're reinterpreting them in the way that now makes, sense." Uh,
Well, don't you
uh,
think they'll say the same thing about America and the Chinese? Because the Chinese, they still own the intellectual property. And then in about 1,000 years, they find some information and they say, oh, the Americans copy the Chinese. I mean,
Well, you think about it. Think of our Statue of Liberty. Uh, somebody in 5,000 years is going to say, "Oh, Statue of Liberty. Where did the Americans get that? Oh, it's just like little Liberty statues from central Turkey in 200 BC. So they must mean the same thing, and they must have copied that." No, there's 2,000 years in between. And of
right,
course, we secularized it. And of course, it was a gift from the French. It's a liberty statue. In other words, it's, we don't think of it as a goddess. We think of a statue representing liberty. And of course,
right,
we do know it has a vestige in its original context of meaning a goddess. Well,
right.
so we've reinterpreted it in a completely different form, and that's exactly what the Israelites do.
It's quite interesting how the one thing that I like to share with you is the fear of syncretism and the worship.
Yeah.
Because one thing that I do notice studying the temple, as you know, I kind of have a little bit of passion for that topic. And when I began to study really the temple and connecting it with all the temples, and it was a little hard in the beginning for me to see sacrifices were done more or less the same way, and they have all this stuff. But then I'm thinking, wait a minute, there's got to be a difference. What is the story behind the story? To whom were they worshiping? Oh, they're not worshiping their gods, but they're gods. But what do their gods represent? Oh, the underworld and the fertility rituals. Ah, okay. So now I understand why Israel did it different and why God says in Leviticus 18, don't do the way the Egyptians and don't do the way the Canaanites do it. Um, I don't think we take the time to really investigate the methods of worship of these countries to understand the message behind the narrative.
Yeah, and it's funny you brought up Leviticus 18 because really, and that's actually rather specific. Do not adopt those practices. And of course, it's the core of intimacy. Do not observe those sexual practices of those people.
Right,
They're corrupt to the bone. And so I'm going to give you a completely new list. And most of it is like, well, that seems pretty obvious to me. No, they're starting from scratch. You have been immersed in complete depravity with Egypt and Canaan. We're starting at ground zero. Um,
right,
and um, and so it's really, really important. But the rest of I mean, it, God doesn't just wipe the entire culture off the map because Israel is part of that culture. He takes them and think of it. Abram is coming from Ur the Chaldees. He's a Mesopotamian. And if you read the rest of Genesis, let's um, when when Laban and Jacob make a covenant before he leaves, um, Laban swears by the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor. Those are probably two different gods. In other words, he's making a
True.
treaty with him and he's using all the different gods. And then what does Jacob say? I swear by one, and he calls it the fear of Isaac. Okay, the one who Isaac respected.
Wait, stop. Let's go to that verse. I haven't seen that.
Yeah.
You're messing me up today. You brought all
Oh
the guns
man,
out, man.
man, sorry.
Wait a minute.
Is that 28? Let's see.
29, maybe?
Uh, oh, it has to be at least 29. You're right. I
Jacob's marriage.
but where when do they have they obviously have to have their
The first
covenant
part,
first.
chapter 29, the first verses. He rolls
Well,
a stone. Then he's talking to him somewhere in verse 10.
okay, but his covenant with Laban's got to be probably in 31, I'm
Oh,
guessing.
okay.
Um,
Yeah, that's right. That's true.
so let's see.
Now Laban has gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel, no, that's when they're leaving.
Oh, here it is, 31:42
Oh, okay, way
or
up
there
there.
or thereabouts.
Oh, I
So,
have it. I
uh,
even have it highlighted. Let me share it.
okay,
Look, check out how much highlight I have. I even have it in capital letters, and I still never got it. Let me read it. Then
yeah.
Laban answered and said to Jacob, "The daughters are my daughters, and the grandsons are my grandsons, and the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see, it is mine now. What can I do for these my daughters today, or for their children whom they have borne? Now come and let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between me and you." Jacob took a stone and set it up as a stone pillar. And Jacob said to his kinsmen, "Gather stones." And they took stones. And Laban called it Hagar Sehadutah, but Jacob called it Galid. Then Laban said, "Pile of the stone between you and me. Therefore,
Oh, it's 53.
okay, gotcha.
Watch
May the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, okay,
the God of
the
their
God
father.
of their father, just judge between us." Then Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac, and Jacob sacrificed to hill
So
on the
Laban,
hill.
the God of Nahor, in other words, he's he's calling in all bets. I'm going to take the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor. In other words, I'm going to make sure I collect all of them. The Hittites do the same thing in their treaties. They're pulling out all the stops. Every God I can think of, I'm gonna call him by name. They're gonna be witnesses here. And
That,
but
but that, but that, but that is what Laban said.
yes, that's Laban. But Jacob, interesting what he says. He says, by the fear of his father Isaac, as if he wants to disassociate himself completely. I'm going to simply do
Or
it
maybe
by the one whom my father respects. What's the fear of Isaac? Obviously, that's the Lord.
right. And
Um,
then, but that's interesting that Laban is doing. You were right. The Hittites is called the country of a thousand gods. Every time they
yes,
do a treaty, they call everything. And by
yes,
the way, let me submit something to you in regards to that. Because we understand that in the ancient Near East, if you serve one God and I serve another God and somebody else serves a different God, and our king is the same king of all of us, but we have loyalty to different gods, it only seems, and I want to make sure I'm on the right track here, that the king would have an allegiance with another king using all the gods that we worship, because then that bounds us on that treaty because you use as a witness the God we worship. Am I correct to assume that?
yes, and because they're polytheists, they don't see this exclusivity of the gods. They can
Okay.
add all of them. And of course, for them, the gods really represent nations. In other words, the god, the Hittites have their primary deity, seems to have been the storm god. We don't even know the name.
Right.
Uh, and and so each country has their own god. This is why Jonah you think about it, what does Jonah do? Maybe with his misunderstanding of things, he thinks that when God tells him to go to Nineveh, he can just go to the other end of the earth. Maybe the Lord doesn't operate in Tarshish, you know, and
Yeah, to him that might have been logical.
yeah, with those Spaniards over there in
Yeah.
Tarshish. And so,
Remember, remember I was telling you about Melchizedek last week and the meal covenant? Listen to this. And Jacob sacrificed a sacrifice on the hill, and he called his kinsmen to eat the meal. And they ate the meal and they spent the night on the hill. So eating a meal was a covenantal ratification.
yes, right.
So it's quite interesting. We have all of the elements of a treaty here.
Yeah, exactly right. But of course, I think treaties are they can become nations. They can be between you and I. If you and
Right.
I sell a piece of land, or our children are exchanged for marriage, uh, that we might call it a contract, but I think that the concept of a treaty is also there. We have thousands of contracts, and they usually don't invoke gods in the contracts, but we know that that's probably what's going on behind the scenes, is that they are making some sort of oath, kind of like praying or putting your hand on a stack of Bibles, to swear or what have you. And so I think
But
same thing.
indirectly, we still have the honor of the God we worship at hand. Because, for example, if you and I do something that goes against the principles of the God that we serve, someone who's not in covenant with that God is going to say, look, this guy supposedly is a believer and brings shame to whom we
Yes,
serve. So we
exactly.
still suffer through it today.
No, no, and in fact, it is true. You think about it. How often do people say, "Oh, I don't want to be a Christian because I've seen so many, mean people that
Yeah,
operate that way." And instead of bad mouthing, you're saying, "Yeah, I'm sorry that's happened because that could be me too."
yeah,
Uh, you have to find another way of doing it. So you're right. We're not supposed to shame,
yeah.
and profane God's name.
So are
Um,
you ready? Are you ready for something?
I'm
I got
ready.
I got something I want to ask you. And I know you're going to want to talk about it because you like itching with talking about it. Well, let me mention a name. Um, Cush father Nimrod.
Oh yeah. Okay.
He began to be a mighty one on the earth, and he was a mighty hunter before the Lord, which is
Yeah.
kind of interesting, before the Lord.
Yeah.
And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad. You're already pulling out the articles. Look at you already ready.
Of course. Um, yeah. And so what do you want to say? So
So, do you think they were king of kings that they were talking about? Because
yeah.
there's Mesopotamian parallels, like for example, the Sargon of Akkad, Saddam, Sin, Gilgamesh. There are different guys who can qualify. Who do you think?
Yeah. Uh, I don't know, but I would say that Sargon and his great grandson Naram Sin are the two great conquerors who also, so they start off at Agade or Akkad, which, by the way, we still haven't found. And it actually could even be in the vicinity of Babylon itself. We don't know. But um, he starts there, and the other two towns that are mentioned in the south are well known, Babylon and Erech or Uruk. And then so when does Nimrod, by the way, that can't be his name, it probably means rebel. Um,
Yeah,
and why is he a mighty hunter? That has I looked at commentary after commentary. Nobody really knows. Um, uh, but but uh, but if you actually Google Nimrod's name, you could get onto a Bugs Bunny cartoon because Bugs Bunny teases Elmer Fudd and calls him Nimrod. Why? Because he thinks he's a mighty hunter. And so they got it right in the 1950s in a cartoon. But anyway, I don't know what it means to be a mighty hunter, except that, for example, later on, Assyrian kings on their well reliefs want to make sure that you know that we hunt animals and we hunt people, and we don't see any difference between them. And so I could hunt a lion. I'm a mighty hunter. I'm a animal hunter. I'm a people hunter. Um, And so that might be the term that maybe it's a mockery that they're being used there, although it's
Yeah,
funny. Some rabbis, and of course, in rabbinical tradition, Nimrod and Abram know each other. Uh,
right.
and so, I mean, it's like, okay, great. That's a wonderful. I think Nimrod must be the intimation is that he is the king at the Tower of Babel. And so when he leaves, he goes up into the north and creates Nineveh and Calah and the other names we don't know. Rehoboth Ir is probably, uh, if it's connected to Nineveh, it might mean the great and wide city or something. We just don't
So
know.
do you think that, because it's kind of strange in chapter 8, chapter 10 is talking about Nimrod, descendants of Noah,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And then chapter 11 goes into the Tower of Babel.
yeah.
But it doesn't say that I know of that it was Nimrod.
No,
We
it does.
assume that it was Nimrod. I mean, we connect. Why
It
do we
it
make that assumption?
because uh, because he's the only one that fits. In other words, there is a king at Babel, and Nimrod is the one who starts Babel and uh, Akkad and Uruk, and he's the one that goes up north. And when would he go up north? Well, it makes this is why you have to look at 10 and 11 in reverse order. That's what I'm saying is that I think chapter 11 happens after chapter 10. But the writer wants you to be thinking of Babel when the story goes into the story of Abraham.
Right.
And so it's like when you watch a movie and things seems to be out of order, it's because they want you to be thinking of things in a different order. So 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 I think about it, the only person in Genesis 10 that has anecdotes about him is Nimrod, which is not his name. It's like calling somebody, I don't know, rebel or jerk, or in other words, he's giving him a bad name. And so
Right.
we don't know what his true name is. We don't even know what Sargon's true name was because Sargon means true king, which is probably not the name mom and dad gave him or mom. So, and by the way, we have an origin story about Sargon that has him floating in a river in a little basket like
Yeah.
this. But
Just like
that's
Moses.
yeah, we'll do that one of these days.
Yeah.
But so
That, it is true. The root name of his name means to rebel,
yeah,
rebel.
so so Assyriologists are trying to look for the name, and I'm thinking, no, it's not his real name. It's a mocking name. It's kind of like David when he interacts with Nabal. Well, Nabal isn't the guy's name. Mom and dad didn't name him fool,
Right.
but that's his essence. That's what he becomes. Kind of like,
Well, if we follow his genealogy, it kind of makes sense. He's the son of Ham,
yeah,
and then he's a descendant of Cush, the firstborn of Ham.
who's already been cursed.
Right, because then you got Egypt, Put, and Canaan. So it doesn't come from a good lineage.
No,
So now it makes sense why his name will be.
yes. And
What,
so
what, what, thing, what gets me is when it says, therefore it was said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. I
yeah.
never understood that. Do you know anything about that?
Just the fact that Assyrian kings go out and they're mighty hunters, and maybe it's doing a mockery of it. I don't know, but I nobody knows for sure. If they tell you they know for sure, run from their interpretation. That's all I can say. I
Yeah,
it's just a confusing, and so we just have to live with the confusion, and I have to live with the fact that I don't know who it is. I gave you that Vandertoorn article, and he thinks that he represents a god, and I'm thinking that's silly. Uh, the last half of that article was he's a really brilliant scholar. I just disagree
yeah.
with that part, but I think it's a real person, and the best option is the first kingmaker Sargon. But other than that, I don't know. Yeah.
Well, that was fun, and I really enjoyed today. I
Yeah.
learned a few things I did not know. And when you think you actually know a story, because we've been studying for a long time, but I learned a few things, and I want to thank you for teaching me today. because I
Well,
didn't know a few things there. So that was a good thing.
and it's just the tip of the iceberg because I'm learning them every day, and I'm thinking, oh, why didn't I know that before? Oh, that's really interesting. So,
Yeah.
uh, so
So tell them when
don't
they
be
can find
surprised.
you. Over your left shoulder, you have your Buried Bible podcast.
Yes. Yep. And so, buried Bible, you just look that up. And like Rico keeps on saying, like, subscribe, and
Share.
share. Yes.
Ah, there you go. You got it.
I don't
You
even
see,
remember the words, but
it's in the bottom. It's in the bottom of it. Says subscribe, like, and share.
yeah.
Right here. It's in the
And
bottom of the thing
um,
on the YouTube, and you can tell
yeah,
the people, hey, subscribe, like, and share. And what that does, it allows you to get more traffic. And I pray, I really do, man. And I'm very grateful to you for everything all the time you spend with me. And I want the audience to know something. You know, one of the things that I so respect about Professor is the fact that we've been together, wow, for a while now studying, and not once has he ever asked for anything. He's only but willingly tried to share what he knows, and I'm forever grateful. And in it, in this journey, I found a really good friend. So I'm very honored to be your friend,
well,
brother.
likewise, I feel the same way. And I have asked him about whether he'd become a Dodger fan again, and that hasn't worked out yet. But that's all right. This is all in good fun, of course. But
There are limits to our friendship.
yeah, well, and I wish you the best in Tennessee this weekend.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, it's
yeah.
good. It went well. It's going to go well. I'm pretty grateful. You recently had a meeting, right?
Yeah, I was in Tennessee visiting my son and his wife.
Well,
Uh,
you spoke somewhere about Genesis
oh
15.
yes, yes. I was in Rochester, Minnesota, which is not far from Wisconsin here, and I spoke on Genesis 15 about what I think is actually traveling through the animal parts. It's the fire pot and the torch are something very well known in Mesopotamia. So maybe we can expand upon that at some point. I'm writing an article about it, and I'm sort of stuck right now because um, I know what the items are, I know what they do, I know what they mean, but I don't know why God would have them travel through the animal parts yet.
All
They're
right.
part of a purification ritual. But it was actually a very nice um, seminar that I went to. I go there every year. I've been doing it for about 25 years. And Labrie is a nice Christian think tank. Some of your listeners might have heard of Francis Schaeffer before. He was a Christian philosopher in the mid 20th century, mostly from the Reformed tradition. But he really tried to make sense of Western culture, putting it in the context of Christianity, and so he founded these L'Abri little centers where people can just go and and meditate and think about God for a month, 2 months, 6 months, and it's just a wonderful place, and it's like I said in my backyard, just an hour and a half from my house.
That's
So
great.
fun,
Well, hopefully we'll get to see each other again. Okay.
absolutely.
We'll see you next week. What do you want to talk about next week?
Well, we'll talk about this. Let's discuss this. It's up for grabs.
All right, we'll do that. Well, thank you guys for joining us today. I pray that it's always edifying to you, that your learning experience is always enhanced. And when you read the Torah and the Bible, it will be edifying because now there's more to the story than just meets the eye. And we're grateful to God personally. We're grateful to the Lord for all the resources and the information that we are able to get today and how much we're learning more about who God is and his character. And obviously, always grateful to you, O Lord, for sending sources and resources like Professor to teach us and to do it from the heart. And that's important. May the Lord bless you and keep you guys. Remember, let me remind you again, subscribe, like, and share.